You don't have to go to the Arctic or Brazilian rainforest to see environmental collapse. It's here on our doorsteps, it's in our fields, our lanes, our hedgerows, and it's here in Britain, and it's in our national parks, places we normally associate with natural beauty or unspoilt wilderness. My work explores how we engage with these landscapes, how we interpret and represent the landscape in this context, and exposing some of the myths and the conflicts that exist. I grew up in the Pembrokeshire National Park, and the smells, the sounds are in my veins. I love the place, but like most of Britain, nature here is in real trouble. There's hardly any fish left in the sea, which is why the cliffs are virtually empty of seabirds. After a storm here, the beach is completely covered in plastic pollution. The water may look really inviting, but the truth is it's full of toxic microplastics, and this has all happened in my lifetime. Look inland and things aren't a lot better. I took a photograph here called Green Gorse. At first you think you're above a luscious tropical rainforest, but as you come closer you realise it's just stubby Welsh gorse. Initially I was attracted by this sort of slab of green colour and against this clear white background, but I was trying to make a sort of monochrome abstraction from sort of monoculture agriculture. It's really just a reflection of, I think, of the lack of biodiversity along the coast here. The National Museum Wales exhibition at Oriel y Parc consists of two bodies of work. My large-scale landscapes, which were taken in the landscape, and photographs of found objects that I've picked up while working in the landscape and then photographed back in the studio. And we've mixed these works together because, in essence, we feel they are both landscapes. The more traditional representations of the land are, in effect, depicting man's impact on nature, and then the smaller one-to-one objects are depicting nature's impact back on the man-made. One of the first themes of the show that I'm looking at is this idea of nature and confusion, and this is a piece called Hedgerow Confusion. What I've done is I've layered two photographs on top of each other. One is a hawthorn tree in the autumn in berry over a blackthorn in blossom in the spring. The idea is it's sort of a way of trying to almost confuse the viewer, which is what's going on here. Because this is some of the things that are actually happening in nature, things just coming out at odd times and overlapping. Sticking with the idea of sort of nature and confusion, I was driving up through the tourist routes of northwest Scotland, and I came across this place called Loch Clooney. The land seemed really strange, and I made this photograph in a rush. It's my last plate of the day, and I think I made a double exposure because the picture is very strange. I can't quite decipher it. And I think I like the idea of the strangeness of the picture kind of reflects the strangeness of the location. I found out later that this is land that had been repeatedly flooded for the hydroelectric industry. And as a result, everything was rotting. There's no sound of any birds. It was like being on the bottom of the seabed and the tide had gone out. It was like a crazy man-made landscape. Another piece that perhaps shows this confusion in nature is this photograph I took of the sole of a flip-flop with crustaceans eating the plastic. You know, it may look like a beautiful object, but the narrative here is showing how these PCBs and toxins get into our food chains. There's also the photograph of an old platform shoe where you can see There are small animals actually living in the sole of the platform. It looks a bit like an apartment block. But again, it's this idea of nature and manufactured materials starting to be integrated. I've also included these lumps of plastic. They're actually called plastigomerates, a technical term. And they are basically lumps of plastic that I found while walking the beach. And they comprise bits of stone, bits of sand, bits of plastic, melted plastic. And some of the brighter coloured ones, they look like sort of mini asteroids, sort of otherworldly. And then other ones look just like real stones. And until you pick it up and see how light it is, you actually think it's a real stone, which just shows you that our natural geology is changing. And plastic is becoming part of, our soil, our earth. These grid-like photographs is another way of telling the story of what's happening on our seashores, what's getting washed up. This first one here is the remains of one of those blue veggie cartons you sometimes see in the vegetable market. And ironically, I found it on a beach called Freshwater West. Part of the problem with these structures is that seabirds get their feet caught in the holes, which can be deadly. I've always been interested in the grid as a device for artists, either breaking away from traditional representation or utopian ideas and architects use for city design. But rather than representing utopian ideas, I think what we're now seeing is the sea spewing back these grid-like structures in a kind of dystopian way. I was working on an artist residency in North Wales, and I came across this piece of what looked like marble or alabaster. It's actually just foam, but the closer I looked, I realised it had these kind of marks from seabirds or talons of seabirds scratching it. And I realised some seabird had tried to scratch for food, and I called the piece Pecked Foam. And for me, it kind of tells the story of the plight of seabirds in Britain. I mean, something like 96% of seabirds have plastic in their guts. This hedgerow here has been cut neatly by a farmer, and in the winter I photographed this hawthorn just after it had been cut, and I think it's a kind of symbol of a sort of culture that wants to tidy up nature, to control nature rather than let it flourish. And hedgerows are so important for wildlife and for bird life in particular. These hawthorn trees are kind of like outcast trees, sort of confined to the hedgerow. They don't have the status of the grand oak tree, but my Italian friend calls them the olive trees of the north, and they really are beautiful. But they're threatened by climate change, just like a lot of other species. I decided to make a record of the trees here at our farm, a bit sort of echoing the Becker's work where they recorded the industrial structures in Germany, but here I'm kind of recording our natural architecture. There's a real threat that we might lose them in years to come. I was making this piece of work in the Eland Valley Nature Reserve a couple of years ago. Very similar landscape to this, very open, and there was a bench just sitting there sort of staring into the open landscape. And for me, I thought it was a nice symbol of the debate between people who believe these open landscapes represent a kind of unspoilt wilderness, places of solitude, escape from the city life, if you like, places where you can go and find yourself, as opposed to others, and I think myself included, that see them as sort of post-apocalyptic wet deserts, areas that are in desperate need of rejuvenation. I mean, the main problem here is this continuous sheep grazing, because to keep the gorse down, they have to burn it every year. And for some, it's seen as sort of an ancient tradition, but for a lot of ecologists, it's a form of environmental vandalism. And the problem is, it kills birds, it releases carbon into the atmosphere. And anyway, we need this land for fresh regeneration and high biodiversity. I thought I'd take a photograph to echo those sort of 19th century romantic paintings of the rural idyll, nature in harmony and constable clouds. You know, children grow up thinking this is how nature should be, and this is what nature was always like. But is nature in harmony here? A lot of people would argue this is land that, you know, is very low in biodiversity. This is a photograph called Cross, which I took in Rannoch Moor on the tourist route up through Scotland. And I've been reading Robert Macfarlane's book, Wild Places, in which he describes Rannoch Moor as this, in very sort of romantic terms, as this sort of amazing, wild, unspoilt wilderness. But when I got there, it felt like the scenes of a First World War battle. This form of sort of clear felling forestry is terrible for the environment. We used to fear nature, you know, the sublime, awesome powers of nature, but maybe now we fear what we humans have done to nature. You know, the artist Graham Sutherland, who made a lot of work here in Pembrokeshire, talks about this idea of ugliness and beauty. Nietzsche famously said also that there are no beautiful surfaces without a terrible depth. And I think, you know, that there is this tension in any work that deals with the degradation of the land. On the one hand, you can create quite a sort of a powerful image, but there's always that narrative, which leaves you with this sort of bittersweet feeling. A few years ago, I started noticing the ash dieback here, which is really hitting us hard in West Wales, and I wanted to make work about it. One evening, I was just coming to the studio late, and the moonlight was up, and I saw that the moonlight was lighting up the dead branches of the ash trees right here next to where I work, and I thought, I've got to go and grab the camera and take this. So I went back out there and took a sort of 5-minute exposure, and you know, it's so close to home now. The dieback is hitting all our trees here at the farm, and it's going to be devastating across Britain, as it will fundamentally change the British landscape when they all die off. This is a flip-flop where the erosive effects of the sea and the sun have created almost tributary-like markings. It's a micro-landscape, if you like. On the one hand, it's become a beautiful object, but we can't forget that this plastic is breaking down into the sea and releasing toxins into the sea's ecology. One day I found this plastic bottle on a beach. It had this really interesting sort of black and white patina, and so I took it back to the studio to photograph, and I'm sure I could see little things moving inside it. I thought, what is that? So I opened the top and looked inside, and as I looked inside, these flies flew out into my face. So maybe nature was trying to send me a message. I presented many of the objects in the form of grids, and this is just a way of me getting across the idea of the ubiquity of plastic and our sort of consumer society, and this idea that now we have sort of infinite choice and we can get a bottle or a shoe or flip-flop in any colour, shape, size we like. I photographed the sides of containers that have washed up on beaches in Pembrokeshire. These are all collected on a beach called Newgale, and by photographing the sides really in a lot of detail, I want to capture all the sort of scratch marks that show the history of the bit of plastic, the container, as it's been washed around, out to sea, back into the beach. And if you like, they're my kind of ready-made seascapes. And of course the colours are the bright industrial colours, again, are very different from the colours you'd normally associate with a seascape painting or drawing. I found this lump of plastic in a field nearby. It looks like it's sort of a heart shape or a continent maybe. When you look closely, you can see there's sort of burnt fertilizer bags in the centre of it. And for me, it kind of portrayed the prevalence of plastic now in our ecology. It also looks a bit like the American eagle, and the red, white and blue colours made me think of America, Britain and farming standards post-Brexit. Despite the environmental crisis here in Britain, I still remain optimistic. You know, I've seen for myself how quickly nature comes back if it's given the right conditions. We can't blame the farmers for what's going on. In most cases, it's the government policies that cause unsustainable practices. The farmers I know, farm here, deeply care about their animals and the land, but we've just got to balance this food production with biodiversity. As an artist, there's only so much we can do. What art does is it bears witness to what's going on, but we need a complete renaissance in the way we think about how we coexist with the other species with which we share this planet. It's not ours alone to destroy.